The first thing Gabriel felt was the scent of rain. The damp aroma of wet earth filled his nostrils, and when he opened his eyes, he realized he was no longer in his bedroom. The sky above pulsed like a living organism, shifting colors every second: deep blue one moment, spectral purple the next. Beams of light danced on the horizon, forming symbols that seemed almost familiar, as if trying to tell him a secret. He took a step forward and noticed he was floating. There was no ground beneath him. Only a thin layer of golden mist separated his body from the infinite abyss below. "Where am I?" His voice echoed strangely, as if the space around him were folded onto itself. That's when he realized he wasn't alone. In the distance, silhouettes moved. They were distorted, like reflections in a shattered mirror, but they were there, watching, waiting. And then, one of them began walking toward him. Gabriel tried to step back, but there was nowhere to run. The space around him bent and expanded, as if it were alive. The figure came closer and closer until he could see its face, or rather, the lack of one. The being before him was shaped like an ordinary man, but its skin was too pale. Its eyes were bottomless black voids, and its mouth, or what should have been a mouth, was just a thin crack in the skin. When it smiled, Gabriel felt ice crawl up his spine. "You took too long to return," the thing whispered. Before Gabriel could scream, the world around him shattered into 1,000 pieces. He woke up suddenly, in the dark, but something was wrong. His room was no longer the same. Gabriel's heart pounded against his chest. The darkness in his room felt off. The shadows on the walls were denser, as if they had weight. The air was heavy, charged with something he couldn't explain. He tried to convince himself it had been just a dream, but something inside him screamed otherwise. His hands trembled as he reached for the lamp beside his bed. He twisted the switch. Nothing. The room remained bathed in darkness. And that's when he noticed the mirror on the wall wasn't reflecting his room as it should. Gabriel froze. The mirror did show his room, but not exactly. The bed was messy on the wrong side. The dresser looked slightly larger, and the most disturbing detail, the wardrobe door was open in the reflection, but closed in reality. He turned toward the real wardrobe, closed, looked back at the mirror, open. His chest tightened. Something inside him told him not to look inside that wardrobe, but he did. There, in the reflected darkness, two black eyes stared at him. They were too low, at floor level, as if something were crouching inside, silently watching him. Gabriel felt his blood freeze. The room around him grew colder, the air thicker. Then the eyes blinked, and the wardrobe door creaked open on its own, slowly. Gabriel held his breath. He didn't want to see what was inside, but it was as if his mind was being pulled into that void. That's when his reflection moved on its own. Gabriel hadn't moved, but his mirror image had. In the mirror, he saw himself rise from the bed, a movement he had never made. His reflection turned its head to stare at him with empty, soulless eyes. "Wake up," the reflection whispered, and then it smiled. It was the last thing Gabriel saw before the mirror exploded into 1,000 shards, scattering across the room like razor-sharp blades. He fell back, covering his face, while the sound of the explosion still echoed in his mind. Silence returned. The room seemed the same. The mirror was whole again. The wardrobe was closed. But something inside him knew that nothing was normal. After all, he could still hear the whisper echoing in his head. "Wake up." The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Gabriel was still on the floor, muscles tense, heart pounding against his ribs. He stared at the mirror, now intact, trying to convince himself that none of it had happened. But he knew it had. The voice still echoed in his mind. "Wake up." He swallowed dryly and forced himself to breathe. Tried to tell himself it was just a nightmare, but the lingering cold on the back of his neck said otherwise. That's when he noticed something even stranger. The digital clock beside his bed blinked 3:33 am. Exactly the same time as yesterday and the day before. His stomach churned. Had he forgotten to reset the clock? Maybe, but something inside him said that wasn't the case. A noise interrupted his thoughts. Tick, tick, tick. It was faint, irregular, like something scratching against wood. Gabriel felt a shiver run down his spine. The sound was coming from inside the wardrobe. His mouth went dry. The wardrobe was closed, but the sound persisted, now louder. Tick dash tick dash tick. It's just a rat, he tried to rationalize. though he knew it wasn't. With trembling hands, he stood up and approached the wardrobe, each step echoing on the floor as if the room had grown larger. He reached out, grasped the handle, took a deep breath, and then the door opened on its own. A wave of freezing air hit him, as if the space inside the wardrobe was a corridor with no end, a tunnel of shadows. Gabriel's eyes widened as he realized there were no clothes inside, only darkness, a darkness that moved. And then he saw it. Pale hands began to emerge from the depths of the void, scratching at the floor, the wood, as if something was trying to crawl out. He tried to step back, but his body wouldn't obey. His feet were stuck to the ground. A rotten smell filled the air, like damp earth mixed with decaying flesh. Gabriel tried to scream, but a familiar voice whispered in his ear before he could react. "I warned you." It was his own voice. Cold fingers gripped his ankles and pulled. Gabriel fell into the darkness, and everything disappeared. The impact never came. Gabriel felt his body being pulled into the void, but there was no ground, no air, nothing but absolute darkness. His heart pounded, adrenaline burning through his veins, yet he was powerless, floating in an endless abyss. The silence was maddening. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the emptiness, as if the space around him devoured sound itself. Then, something began to take shape in the dark. First, a faint light flickered, like a distant candle. Then, shadows started to mold into place, like black ink spreading across wet paper. Lines connected, forming shaped streets, buildings, flickering streetlights. The world around him was constructing itself, as if being drawn in real time. His feet finally touched the ground, and Gabriel realized where he was. His city, but not exactly. The streets were distorted. The traffic signs bore symbols that made no sense. The sky was a deep crimson, and the air carried the scent of rust and burnt flesh. There was no one around. No voices, no life. Only the eerie hum of flickering lights and the distant howl of the wind. Gabriel turned slowly, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then he saw it, his reflection in a store window. But it wasn't him. The figure in the glass stared back, but its eyes were hollow, two black voids. Its mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. Then the reflection moved on its own. Gabriel remained frozen as his mirror image pressed a hand against the glass, tilting its head, studying him with an unsettling curiosity. The grin widened, revealing sharp, needle-like teeth. Finally, the words did not come from the glass. They came from behind him. Gabriel's body stiffened, a breath cold as death brushed against the back of his neck. Then, fingers, ice cold, rested on his shoulder. Something was standing behind him. His heart stopped for a split second. The air thickened, suffocating him. With slow, trembling movements, he turned his head, and all he saw were those black, empty eyes. A grotesque, inhuman smile stretched across the figure's face. The world trembled around him, and then, once again, the darkness swallowed him whole. Gabriel's eyes snapped open. His body lay sprawled across a cold, damp surface. The air around him was thick, saturated with the metallic scent of rust and decay. As he attempted to move, a deep shiver ran down his spine. Something was wrong with gravity. The world around him pulsed. He lifted his gaze and saw the sky upside down. The clouds weren't floating. They were collapsing, drifting downward like heavy smoke. The horizon twisted upon itself. Buildings stretched, unnaturally tall, their forms warping as if made of melting wax. The streetlights flickered irregularly, pulsating like a heartbeat. Then, the sound came. Footsteps. From every direction. Gabriel spun around. Nothing, just silence. Then, in the reflection of a dusty, cracked window, he saw them, silhouettes lurking in the shadows. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, bending at impossible angles. They lacked faces, only elongated figures, shifting like fractured echoes of human forms. His throat tightened. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't a hallucination. He was here. The footsteps quickened. Now they were running. His instincts screamed before his mind could fully process the danger. Gabriel turned on his heels and ran. The streets stretched endlessly, repeating themselves like a cruel loop. No matter how far he sprinted, the alleys remained the same twisted, infinite copies of a world that shouldn't exist. And then he saw it. At the end of the street, a door. A red door. Unlike everything else, it wasn't distorted. It wasn't broken. It was real. He didn't think, he just ran faster. His lungs burned, his muscles ached, but he pushed forward. Behind him, the whispers and scraping noises grew louder, the unseen figures closing in. The cold breath of something unnatural brushed against his skin just as his fingers grasped the doorknob. He yanked the door open and threw himself inside. The world outside vanished. Silence. Gabriel lay on the floor, gasping for air. His heart pounded like a war drum. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to calm himself. Then, slowly, he opened them, and his breath caught in his throat. He was back in his bedroom. The warm glow of the bedside lamp, the hum of the night air outside, the faint ticking of the clock. The wardrobe was closed. The mirror was intact, but Gabriel knew something was wrong, because deep inside, he was absolutely certain of one terrifying truth. He had never woken up. Gabriel remained lying on the floor, trying to catch his breath. The silence in his room felt like a relief, but an uneasiness lingered inside him. He knew he wasn't truly awake. His eyes wandered across the room. Everything seemed normal, yet something was off. The digital clock blinked 3:33 am. Again, the sound of the wind outside felt artificial, like a repetitive recording. And most disturbingly, his reflection in the mirror hadn't moved. Gabriel felt his stomach churn. And then, he heard it. Knock, knock, knock. A knock at his bedroom door. His entire body tensed. The sound was subtle but carried something unnatural, as if it hadn't been made by a human, as if something was pretending to mimic a human gesture. He held his breath. Knock, 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 louder this time. The doorknob slowly turned. Gabriel wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. The door creaked open, revealing a corridor drowned in shadows. Cold air seeped into the room, carrying the scent of damp earth and rust. And then, he stepped inside. A tall, thin figure, dressed in an old black suit that looked like it belonged to another century. The man stood at the doorway, and he had no face. Pale skin stretched where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been, like a wax mask smoothed over. Yet, somehow, Gabriel felt the man was watching him. The figure slowly raised one arm and pointed directly at him. Then, the room's light flickered violently. The faceless man advanced. Gabriel screamed and tried to back away, but the moment he blinked, the man was gone. The only thing left was the mirror, and in its reflection, Gabriel saw something that made his skin crawl. The faceless man was still there, but now he was Gabriel himself. Panic overtook Gabriel. His lungs struggled for air, but he felt like he was drowning. The reflection in the mirror remained. His own body, but without a face. The smooth skin where his eyes, mouth, and nose should be seen to shift subtly, as if something pulsed beneath it. He took a step back, but the reflection did not. The silence in the room was crushing. Then, the reflection moved. Gabriel watched in horror as his faceless double tilted its head, as if studying him. Slowly, the figure lifted a hand and pressed its palm against the mirror. The glass cracked. A thin fracture spread across the surface, and with it, a sharp, searing pain exploded inside Gabriel's head. He screamed, clutching his skull. The pressure was unbearable, as if something was trying to force his mind out of his own body. The lights flickered, the walls trembled, and then the mirror shattered completely. But instead of breaking into pieces, the glass melted into liquid, rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond, and the reflection began to step through. Gabriel tried to run, but something grabbed his ankle. A hand reaching out from inside the mirror. The skin was cold, clammy its grip and humanly strong. He kicked, thrashed, screamed, but the hand climbed higher, gripping his leg, his torso, his neck. And then, the world collapsed. The walls split apart as if gravity itself had been shattered. The ceiling dissolved into inky darkness, and the floor disintegrated beneath his feet. Gabriel fell. His scream was lost in the abyss as the world spiraled around him. He saw flashes of impossible places, ancient ruins swallowed by fog, endless corridors lit by flickering neon lights, a desert where the sky was made of watching eyes. And then, a whisper echoed through the void. "You've been here before." The impact hit like an electric shock. Gabriel's eyes flew open. He was back in his bedroom, or at least something resembling it. The walls felt tighter, the ceiling lower. The digital clock still blinked 3:33 am, but the numbers were warped, flickering as if unstable. And then, he saw it, on the bed, lying exactly where he should have been. Another Gabriel, his own body, sleeping peacefully. His heart stopped. He tried to speak, no sound came out. Then the other Gabriel's eyes opened and smiled. The world around Gabriel seemed to freeze. He was standing there, but he was also lying in bed. Impossible. Yet, there he was, his own body stretched across the sheets, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm, as if he were merely sleeping. Then the other Gabriel's eyes opened. They weren't normal. They were black, deep and endless, like two voids consuming the light. Gabriel felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine as he watched his own face smile at him. The other Gabriel tilted his head slightly, like a predator examining its prey. Then, he sat up. "You took long enough to notice." The voice was his own, identical, but something was wrong. The tone was calm, almost kind, but beneath it lurked a quiet malice, like something mocking him. Gabriel tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't move. The room felt smaller, the shadows on the walls thicker, as if alive. The bedside lamp flickered. The clock still read 3:33. Aman. The other Gabriel laughed. "You still think you're awake?" A deep, suffocating pressure filled the room. Gabriel's chest tightened as the air grew dense, suffocating. "What is happening?" His voice came out weak, barely above a whisper. The other Gabriel grinned wider, his teeth too white, too perfect. "I am you." The light bulb above them burst. For a split second, the room plunged into complete darkness. When the dim light returned, the other Gabriel was standing right in front of him, so close that Gabriel could feel his breath cold and unnatural. A whisper brushed against his ear. "And now, I'm the one waking up." The other Gabriel's hands shot out, grabbing his throat. His grip was ice cold and impossibly strong. Gabriel tried to scream, but the fingers tightened, choking the sound before it could escape. His lungs burned, his vision blurred. His pulse pounded in his skull. Then, with inhuman strength, the other Gabriel shoved him backward. Glass shattered around him. The world crumbled. Everything twisted into a vortex of images, voices, and darkness. He was falling, until silence. Gabriel's eyes flickered open. He was lying in bed. His room looked normal, but the air was too warm. The scent in the room was wrong. The texture of the sheets felt off. Slowly, he sat up. Then his gaze drifted to the mirror, and his reflection didn't move. Gabriel's stomach twisted into knots. His reflection wasn't moving. He blinked. The figure in the mirror didn't. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But it was. Slowly, he stepped forward, his movements shaky. The reflection remained still, watching. The room was silent, but the air felt alive, vibrating with something unseen. Then, the reflection smiled, not a normal smile. A wide, distorted grin, stretching too far across its face. Gabriel recoiled. The reflection took a step forward. From inside the mirror, Gabriel stumbled back, his pulse hammering against his ribs. "You took too long." The voice echoed inside his head. The reflection raised one hand and touched the surface of the mirror. A crack spread across the glass. A deep, black fissure, pulsing like a wound in reality itself. Gabriel's breath hitched. His body screamed for him to run, but his legs felt trapped, cemented in place. The reflection spoke again. "This was always the plan." Gabriel shook his head. No, this isn't happening." But the crack in the mirror widened, and then the glass exploded. But the shards didn't fall. They floated, suspended in the air, reflecting 1,000 distorted versions of Gabriel. And from within the broken fragments, the other Gabriel stepped out, identical, perfect. But something was wrong. His skin was too smooth, his eyes were too deep, the smile too knowing. Gabriel backed away until he hit the wall. The other Gabriel advanced. "I think it's clear now. Who belongs here?" His voice was calm, almost gentle. "And who doesn't?" The air was sucked from the room. Gabriel tried to scream, tried to run, but his feet left the ground. The floor wasn't there anymore. He was falling into the abyss. And in that final moment, the truth hit him like a dying breath. He was never the original. Darkness swallowed Gabriel whole. The weight of the void crushed his chest, like he was sinking into an endless abyss. Time no longer existed, but the truth was there. It whispered to him, repeating over and over, "You were never the original." The words echoed inside his mind, coming from every direction at once. His body trembled, his mind fought against it, denying, resisting, struggling, but there was nowhere to run. Memories came rushing back, the dreams, the mirrors. The clock frozen at 3:33 a.m. Suddenly the darkness began to dissolve, like ink spreading through water. Shadows bled into images. And then he saw him, the other Gabriel, standing in the room. But now he was perfect. His skin, his voice, his eyes, they were exactly as they should be, because he was real now. And Gabriel? Gabriel was just a mistake, something created in the place of the true Gabriel, wandering through dreams, never realizing he was the one who didn't belong. His chest tightened. He wanted to fight, to demand his place, to return. But to where? His body began to dissolve. His fingers turned to dust. His arms faded into golden particles. This was always the end. The other Gabriel's voice echoed through the darkness. I am real. You were just a reflection that took too long to understand. Gabriel's face crumbled away. And then everything ended. The alarm clock buzzed. 7 a.m. Sunlight streamed through the window. Gabriel stretched, yawning. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. The room felt warm, comfortable, normal. His gaze drifted to the mirror. His reflection stared back at him. Then slowly, it smiled. Gabriel grinned, rolling his shoulders as he got out of bed. Time to start the day, because after all, he had always been here, hadn't he?